Welcome back to Coffee Kurosawa, a podcast where a film geek and a film fan have a cup of coffee and talk about the films they love. I'm Ben Filipkowski, your resident film geek.
And I'm Farrah Sarpkaya, a film fan, but in a super chill, I keep seeing this on top 100 lists, and I feel like I should probably know what's up kind of way.
And this week, we're talking about Citizen Kane, the 1941 directorial debut of Orson Welles, who also co-wrote the movie and starred in the title role. Citizen Kane is, without a doubt, one of the biggest names in the canon of film history and criticism, and for very good reason. It pioneered a ton of filmmaking techniques that have become so commonplace, watching this movie now can seem maybe a little bit underwhelming. But there's a very good reason it has consistently been declared one of, if not the greatest film of all time. Not to mention the fact that it had a number one spot on countless critic polls for decades. We're going to get into that a bit as we discuss this movie, but before we do so, heads up, we will be discussing spoilers about this movie. This is, what, an
83 years old movie?
83-year-old movie, so maybe a bit of a delayed spoiler warning. But if that's a thing you do care about, be aware. I also wanted to give a quick note on some of the content. As always, viewer discretion is advised watching any movie. This movie includes brief scenes of domestic abuse and violence, as well as a scene where a character attempts to take their own life. So, broadly, we're going to be looking at this movie's impact on cinematography as a whole, specifically how it pioneered some really impressive tricks and techniques, but also how actors are framed, lit, and shot. This kind of helps emphasize character and theme. Before we really dig into that, though, Farrah, you were messaging me as you watched this, so I already have a bit of a sense of how you're going to answer this, but what did you think of this movie?
So, the only thing I knew about this movie going in was that it's on the top of like every top 100 movie list ever created. It is a cultural zeitgeist in the West. And I am convinced they're all really just top 99 lists because Citizen Kane is number one by default. It's like that piece of paper that's already filled in. It's a lot of movie, and I actually watched it twice this week to make sure I got all of the nuance and all that stuff. The movie is honestly a fascinating look at a life through a lens that plays with and distorts perspective, distorts truth, and is really masterful in how it frames, in every sense of the word, the story and the characters. Did I like it, though? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out. I think I enjoyed it in the same way I enjoy the book House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielski. I never read that book because I like it necessarily, but every time I do reread it, and I have done, I get more out of it. I see more details, more tricks, more little experiments that he's deployed. And I realize how much I missed every other time I have read it. And that's what I felt like when I watched it twice this week, right? And the two things that really struck me, the first is I don't trust it one bit, and I mean that in the best possible way. The whole movie is framed as a newsreel, other than one word spoken at the very front, which we'll get into before it kicks off. But Kane himself, our main character, never says a word that isn't said by someone else, and that's a fascinating little detail. If we didn't have these flashbacks that are acted out by the cast, if this was a book, it would just be other people putting words in his mouth. So we never actually get the main character's perspective. And so I don't really trust the story of the life that is given to us. And I think that's a really cool experience from a piece of media. And then the other thing was how relevant it still felt. You probably could have told me this was made as Oscar bait in 2024, and I probably would have believed you. But all that to say, I'm going to throw it back to you for the summary because I could go on for forever.
Yeah, right on. So, to summarize this movie, it is a pretty straightforward plot, all things considered. Citizen Kane starts with an elderly Charles Foster Kane in his mansion, lying in his bed. He holds a snow globe, gazes at it, and says one word, Rosebud. He then dies. Roll credits. Movie over. Just kidding, we are only getting started. We speed run through the life of publishing mogul Charles Foster Kane via a newsreel. Kind of gives us a bit of a preview of some of the events that we're going to be privy to later on. And then a reporter who is watching this newsreel in the newsroom is then assigned the task of interviewing people who are close to Kane to figure out what Rosebud is or was. So word has gotten out that his last word was Rosebud. Everyone wants to know what the hell did he mean by this. This is thus our frame narrative. A reporter, Thompson, is researching Kane to try and learn more about the man, figure out who he was, and of course, figure out the mystery of Rosebud. He does everything from reviewing memoirs from Kane's now deceased legal guardian, Mr. Thatcher. He interviews Kane's estranged business manager, Mr. Bernstein. He talks to Jedediah Leland, Kane's former best friend and colleague. And finally, after being rebuffed at the start of the movie, he gets a chance to speak to Kane's ex-wife, Susan Alexander, who is now, at this point in her life, an alcoholic lounge singer struggling with the demons of her past. We are kind of thus privy to the life and times of Citizen Kane through flashbacks with these characters, presented by these characters. But in the end, Thompson is almost left with even more questions than he started out with, even if at the same time he understands a little bit more of who Kane was. All the same, he's not able to figure out an answer to Rosebud. He does not learn at any point what Rosebud might be. He does understand that more people might have some insight on this as he asks those questions. The truth remains elusive. Only we as the audience are treated to the truth. The camera returns to Kane's estate as apparent junk is thrown into an incinerator, including a sled we saw a young Charlie Kane playing with as a boy, on which is the word Rosebud. That's right, it was his sled all along. There's a big metaphor in this. Before we get into all that, though, Farrah, you mentioned having some trust issues with this movie. So talk to me about that, and talk to me about what stood out to you with regards to framing and cinematography.
So I didn't necessarily notice this the first time I watched, but I did notice it the second. First of all, like we kind of talked about already, at no point other than when he says the word Rosebud at the very beginning does Kane actually say anything. He doesn't. It's like your entire. It's not an autobiography. It's a biography. It's someone else writing the story of his life based on the bits and pieces and snippets that all of the people around him can give to this reporter, who remains basically faceless this entire film, which in and of itself is kind of cool, right? And so in listening to all of these stories, in watching how they portray Charlie Kane, and in seeing how these individuals who are giving these stories are profiting, and I'll use a lowercase p for that, profiting off of these stories, whether it's cash, whether it's loneliness and they just need somebody, whether it's a cigar wrapped in a toothpaste tube, they all have a very distinct perspective on who Charlie Kane was and what he did. And not only are we narratively framing this with that of we're seeing Charlie Kane from everyone else's perspective but him, but we also have moments of literal framing when in the first snippet, when it's looking through the memoirs of his legal guardian, you see him playing with his sled through a window. When later on you see him from his colleague's perspective, it's reflected in a window. Later on, it's reflected through 5 million mirrors as his staff are watching him. And even before all of that, when he dies, he drops a snow globe with his family home in it. And he says his last word, and then we see him and the maid who discovers him through the glass of the snow globe. At every turn, this movie tells me they're lying to me. I love it. But also, I'm just like, I don't trust you as far as I could throw you, Orson Welles.
I think it's like the idea of there's a literal and metaphorical lens. So like that idea that when we're looking at something, we're seeing it through our own lens. And the movie really does play with that in a wonderful way. There's also kind of that, I believe it's the chiaroscuro shading that you get in that like really dramatically lit and shadowed artwork. They kind of have that lighting going on with Kane now and then, like when he's doing his it's not the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Principles, I think, when he has the newspaper, he's writing it, his face is in shadow. And then when he's like ready to when he says we're going to publish it, then he comes into the light. So it's kind of like stepping quite literally into a spotlight, and makes you think like, is he really sincere in his declaration of principles here? Is this something that he genuinely believes in, or is this like, is this are we meant to take this a little more cynically and see that he's using this as publicity?
Yeah.
Signs point to the latter, but
yes,
we're shown a lot of conflicting information, which is interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, he's not even the only one that's framed in this way, because the first time the reporter speaks to the former Mrs. Kane, to Susan, she is in the background. Then there's like a big gap, and then there's the reporter in a phone booth calling his editor or whoever to be like, this is where I'm going next. And he's telling the person on the phone all about Susan. We're now getting the reporter's perspective. And it's like so intentionally like, we're literally showing you what we are doing to you. We are removing that space between people and truth and honesty. And it's like, God damn. But I love the use of long shots in this movie for stuff like that, because we have so many layers of things going on all of the time.
Yeah. And those shots are incredibly technically impressive. I'm thinking specifically of, it's pretty early on, and we're over the shoulder of Mr. Bernstein, and I think he's probably middle-aged at this point. He's reading some legal documents, and the shot's kind of framed so that it's over his shoulder, like, yeah, this is the focus of the shot. We're reading these documents with him. He puts the paper down. The camera doesn't really move, but then we see kind of probably 1 meter, 2 meters across from him on this meeting room table, sitting across from him is Mr. Thatcher, who is looking older as well. They have this conversation. It turns out that Bernstein's been reading out loud, just going over terms of this contract with Thatcher. And they have a bit of a conversation. And as Bernstein sits back in his chair, we get like an even longer shot of suddenly, here's Kane walking in the background by the window, like just looking out at the city beyond. This is an incredible little technique. They're using deep focus with the camera, where every element of the shot remains in full focus. So like you don't have that thing that occurs when you're using a camera lens, where something in the foreground, if you're focusing on that, blurs out the background. Foreground, middle focus, and the background are all in sharp relief. You see all the detail. They kind of do this trick a few times throughout the movie. Mm-hmm. I can't stress enough, this is hard to do in 2024, and they were doing it in 1941. It's really incredible. It's very cool, and it's visually a really interesting little trick and technique. To me, it kind of sends me thinking of Jaws. They have the one shot in front of the billboard, where the actual shot composition changes so much depending on how characters are positioned. This is that kind of same idea, but maybe with a little bit more deliberate trickery going on, but in a really fun and cool way.
Yeah. Shameless plug, if you haven't listened to our Jaws episode, which is our first episode ever, go do that. Maybe not the second, but it's a good one. We enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I mean, they do that long shot a bunch of different ways,
Yeah.
too. Like, there's the moment where Kane is standing at Susan's door after she has left him. And she is walking down the world's longest hallway that, for some reason, is a straight shot from her bedroom through, like, 5 different rooms out onto a patio. I don't know. And the camera keeps him in focus, but she keeps going. And other than the fact that it's just a really cool shot, the visual representation after he has basically said to her, look, I'll love you however you want me to. It's like, that's not the point, man. And he loses her. Physically, she leaves the space, but she just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. It's just so cool. There's a lot of cool shots in this movie.
Yeah, there's a ton of cool, just visually interesting things going on. And part of what makes this movie so significant and important is that this is the movie that pioneered that. This is the movie that introduced a lot of that. So deep focus kind of existed, but this movie really solidifies it as a filmmaking technique. You also get it's really early in the movie. It is because I think the first person that Thompson goes to interview is Susan at I cannot remember the lounge's name. It is not
the club that she's at.
Some club, some hotel club. We are treated to like it's a dark and stormy night. The camera is doing this crane shot, moving in on the kind of gate to the hotel grounds, the lounge grounds. It moves through the gate, over the property to a skylight. We see Susan through the skylight. Then there's a quick little dissolve, and the idea is like it's supposed to be this one continuous movement through the exterior into the interior. I remember being in a film studies class as a wee young lad, and the prof was like, "This is the movie that introduced the sick crane shot that you see, like this sort of thing. This is it." I was like, "Oh, okay, cool." And
nice.
I mean, it's interesting to look at. It is, you have to remind yourself almost that like, yeah, this is the first instance of that, because on its own, you know, X number of years later, I can do math, close to a century later, 80 years later, it is, you know, stuff like this is so commonplace, you really take it for granted. So it's really incredible to see something like this being done relatively early in the history of film.
I'm going to say it wasn't the gate. It was the lights and the title of the theater that's usually on the top of the building. So it's like high up and then down, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Because we don't, I believe, enter the other locations where the other interviewees are. We're just there with them at the table or on the patio or whatever. She is the only one that we enter to, and we enter twice because we enter later and we exit later as well when it backs out, which is also very neat. But with that, talk to me about angle and power dynamics, because in the rest of the film, even within the narrative that she tells us, Susan doesn't have a lot of power until the end of their relationship, when she fully just drops the rope and is like, no, I'm done. This is the only thing I can choose to do because everything else you control, Charlie. So why is it so striking that we top down into where she is sitting at a table, drunk, crying about her ex?
Yeah. Yeah. Beyond just being visually interesting, it also kind of sets the stage for us being these... We're observing her life through a lens. Like, we're literally moving through a pane of glass to see her. And that kind of top-down angle comes back into play later on. We see that confrontation she has with Kane when she finally leaves him. We see some of their arguments beforehand as well, and I think it's worth noting that at this initial point, she's kind of framed when she sits down, or I should say, when Thompson sits down to interview her, they're at an even level. Like the power is relatively on equal footing, I would say at this point. But it's through her interactions with Kane that we get the use of angle to represent power dynamic, to represent agency and control. Kane is consistently shot, especially later on in his life, from a low angle to play up his stature, his physicality, his height. He's very imposing. And this leads into the kind of domineering role he takes in controlling her life. And domineering is putting it very lightly. He is pulling all the strings. She is basically forced into a career she does not want because he wants it for her. So she winds up in this kind of failed opera career. We get this the scene of her at the Chicago Opera House that he builds specifically so she has a place to perform. She is not an opera singer. She would have been a great lounge singer if she had focused her career on lounge singing. Probably a very different story. That is not enough for Kane. Thematically, that can tie into so many different things. I'll get myself back on the rails here, but it all kind of blows up when she's finally done with her. She's done with playing the puppet to Kane's whims and hopes and dreams for himself, for his own status and his own stature. There is this interaction, this altercation between them. And she is quite literally like kneeling on the floor, and he's looking down on her. So we are looking down on her as well. This is kind of echoing and amplifying the fact that she has no agency. But when she finally leaves, she stands up. She is also then shot from a lower angle, signifying she now has a bit more power in this relationship. She now has more power in her own life. And we get a lot of that throughout this movie. And part of that, I think, is certainly very deliberate. But part of that, I think, is also, if you look throughout the movie, there are a lot of scenes where it would just be a normal, mid-angle, wide-angle shot of people in a location, but the camera's kind of always below that kind of like equatorial axis, I guess, so to speak. So it's either always giving a little bit of an upwards perspective or a downwards perspective. I think that is just because Wells and his cinematographer Greg Toland found eye-level shots incredibly boring. So they had these special sets made where the cameras can then be like recessed into the floor or kind of go up above where the ceiling would be. This also meant that a lot of the sets have actual ceilings and aren't just like, 3 walls and the imaginary 4th wall, and you just don't tilt the camera up to show the lighting. It's a really cool effect, and it really plays into those repeated power dynamics. Kane is physically imposing and metaphorically imposing. He is both literally and symbolically larger than life in many ways. You love to see it in a film. You love to see that kind of representation of theme and thesis in something like this.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting too because if we're looking at ownership of power, as much as Kane is shown to be this big imposing person, he doesn't get a word in edgewise. And I love that for him. I also found it really cool that there's a GIF that, or an image from the film, but it's used as a GIF very often, of just his face that's like half in shadow.
Yeah.
And I never knew where that was from. I knew it was Citizen Kane, but I was like, I've never seen it before.
Yeah.
But the context is him looking down at Susan as she's performing this completely fake opera because it's not a real opera. It was just written for the movie.
Yeah.
And it's not what I expected it to be because it seems very what's the word I'm looking for? um not intimidating, but like ominous.
Yeah.
Ominous.
Yeah.
Ominous is the word. Because he's looking down at the woman who technically destroyed his marriage to his wife. Not actually. He did that himself, and Getty's, a political rival, did that himself. But, like, for a man who wants, supposedly, to be in control of all of the things,
Mm-hmm.
she was the impetus of a choice that he was forced to make.
Mm-hmm.
And so he forces her to make this choice.
Yeah.
To perform in a way that she is not good at.
Yeah. I mean,
like,
yeah, he's that scene of him clapping. There's like it is both like the tranquil fury, but also he is trying to control reality in a way that he just can't. There's almost the sense of like if he wills it hard enough, if he claps hard enough, everyone will be forced to go along with it. This is demonstrably untrue, as he is repeatedly reminded throughout the movie. But I think it's also interesting that this is also kind of a real... This is also a great lens that we can kind of see his character through. He is drawn to Susan at first because of this kind of like youthful exuberance she has. She has this energy, this joie de vivre that has kind of been beaten out of him a little bit. I think he's beaten it out of himself. He's been so obsessive over running his newspaper. His marriage to his first wife disintegrates over the course of an incredible montage. Like they start off, I think the first bit of this montage is they're newlyweds talking over breakfast. And their conversation continues over the years. Like, each response could be read as a response to a line previously, but then takes on a different context as we kind of meet them over the years of their marriage. And eventually they're just sitting in silence, and Kane's first wife is reading the competing newspaper, the Chronicle, and he is the publisher of the Inquirer. But he is drawn to Susan because, I don't know, there's a bit of a manic pixie dream girl thing going on.
Oh,
He's projecting a lot of his stuff onto her. He has like no joy in his life. He pretends to have a lot of joy in his life. She becomes the source of joy. She becomes the exuberance, the hopeful, earnest optimism for dreams in the future. She'd love to be a singer. Maybe not an opera singer, though, but she'd love to be a singer. So his marriage disintegrates. His wife and his political rival find out about the affair at the exact same time. Incredible dramatic timing. And yeah, we get to the point where they are Susan and Kane are then married, and the inevitable opera. This is kind of where it becomes... He's using her to hold on to something he has lost.
Yeah.
And that kind of becomes the recurring theme for him. And earlier on in the movie, a much younger Kane, in that cool, fun, lighthearted song and dance number, Bernstein and Leland are talking about the newspaper business. And they're saying, like, it's great that we're so successful right now. Let's temper our expectation. Like, you can't go all in this hard on... This cannot be your source of joy. Like, you cannot be... The paper isn't about you. And Kane's like, no, like, I'm here for the paper, and people love me. And that's great. And I think Leland says, yeah, but they're not going to love you on your terms. They're going to love you however they want to love you. Which kind of becomes this repeated pattern throughout his life.
I want to talk a little bit about the two relationships and their visual representation, because we touched on it a little bit just now. First, the framing of the first marriage is told by a third party, one of his old colleagues, because the wife is dead. His son is dead. from a car accident.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, they start off as honeymooners. They're sitting very close together. They're flirting. They're like making little risque jokes that would get past the censors. And then very slowly they get farther and farther apart. Her clothing gets more and more formal. They go from feeding each other all the way to this. And then we have that ultimate moment where we see her for the last time as she leaves him in the building where Susan is.
Mm-hmm.
Before that moment, though, he meets Susan. And I want to talk about that specifically because the first thing she does is laugh at him.
Yeah.
Because she doesn't know who he is. He just got splashed by a carriage that went by and because it's been raining. And his Sunday best gets ruined. And she laughs and he says, "Excuse me, are you laughing at moi?" And you're like, uh-oh. But she invites him in. She leaves the door open because her landlady will be very upset if the door is closed and she has a gentleman caller, in defiance of him because he's closed it. But one of the first thing he does for her is shadow puppets. And this movie has played with shadows so much.
Yeah.
And he's making what he says is a rooster, but she's like, is it a giraffe? What is this thing? And they're sitting equally level together at this couch or lounge or whatever. And then he makes her sing for him. She's in the fore, he's in the back. And she's higher than he is because the couch is low. And that's when we start to have the rest of it, where his life is derailed and then he gets married to her and he tries to control her and the dynamic switches. And he is high up in the box seats. She is lying down in the, like, on stage and etc. And the visual storytelling that they do here with that blocking that you've talked a bit about, with the shots of where they are on the screen is very cool. But particularly I want to pick at the shadows a bit because we've talked a bit about lighting already. But talk to me a bit more about lighting, because here he's literally playing with shadows.
Yeah. I mean, obviously lighting in any movie it's how you make sure you see things on the screen. It's how you make sure that things are visible to the camera. And I mean, that can be as basic as like, let's just make sure everything is well lit. But it can also be used to very dramatic effect, like this. And it can be used as a bit more of a creative and metaphorical tool, in that we kind of see a lot of this stuff of like these character obscured by shadow, character comes out of the shadows into the light. They're really simple, basic visual metaphors, but they're really effective because we just have such an ingrained sort of understanding of like light and dark as human beings and as people who experience a story, that like someone being heavily shadowed automatically makes them look different. It can add like a sinister air to things. Someone being well lit, brightly lit, can look angelic, like a divine, holy being, that incredibly heroic, that sort of thing. So the fact that we have so many instances of Kane and other characters being cast in such shadow really, I think for me at least, it really lends itself to that notion of Kane being this very divisive figure in the world of the movie. There is both light and shadow in him. Like literally, he starts off with pretty noble intent. His stated goal, when he starts out, he becomes a very rich man, very young, and then he immediately starts attacking the business ventures and business interests of Thatcher, his legal guardian turned rival. Thatcher also points out, like, but you're attacking your own business interests too. And Kane's like, well, yeah, like, because I'm a champion of the working man. I'm a good left-leaning bleeding heart, up workers' rights, that sort of thing. Um, so I think like if I'm jumping back a little bit, I was talking about that bit where he is doing the declaration of principles. He is in the shadow. When he's ready to publish, he is in the light. And notably, he is referred to as a yellow journalist because functionally he's doing muckraking tabloid stuff. Um, so I think that a lot of the use of shadow here really just plays into that kind of, it's not so black, it's not so much black and white. It's more like the shades of gray morality about this character, about who he is and what he's all about.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also reflected in, I mean, there's the newsreel at the beginning. He's accused equally of being a communist and a fascist. We see him posing with extremely notable communists and fascists. Uh, it's also worth noting that a large amount of the model for Kane is William Randolph Hearst, the American publishing mogul. Despite the best efforts of Orson Welles and other people involved in making the movie to insist otherwise, like the parallels are just completely, once you dig into them, they are there for everyone to see. That being said, it's not necessarily like a hit job on Hearst. It is, they are trying to examine, the complexities of like a public figure. All that being said, a lot of this stuff Hearst actually did to some extent or was inspired by stories about Hearst. So that's where you get the who's this German chancellor that you're standing next to in 1939 or thereabouts? Who could that person be? Uh, so you get this deliberate attempt to muddy things with like, is Kane a good guy? Is Kane a bad guy? Like, who is this person? That's the driving question of the movie in many ways, and we see that visually reflected through a lot of the filmmaking techniques that are employed here.
Well, I think that speaks back to my ultimate, like, I don't trust this movie because how can you say you know a person? And this even speaks to modern celebrity culture, right? There's a lot of stuff going on right now around how much rights do fans and super fans or whatever have to the life and information about the celebrities they worship.
Mm-hmm.
And how much do you really know a celebrity based on the persona that they put out into the world and the way that they interact with the individuals around them? And so as we look at this as maybe a men like Mr. Hearst, for example, how much do we know of him as a human being versus how much do we know of him as a corporate figurehead versus how much do we know of his soul?
Yeah.
And that's very much this movie
Mm-hmm.
of how much do we know of Kane based on the fact that we're telling all of these stories about him, but never does he get a chance to speak.
Yeah.
One cool thing that you pointed out to me was there's a shot at the front of the Chronicle where Kane is like, it took them 8 years or something to collect all of these incredible writers. And then the photo turns into a live shot.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of really cool tricks like that.
Yeah.
I imagine this movie was one of the first, if not the first, to do a lot of that stuff. Talk to me about like some of those trick shots that we see, and how they changed the industry, if they did.
Yeah, I think like the thing that stands out to me about that stuff is that a lot of this is kind of hidden, or if it's not necessarily hidden, there's an attempt to draw attention to the trickery. Like you're meant to think like, oh, that was cool, because it is that zoom in on the Chronicle. The entire journalistic team at the rival newspaper is presented in this like I don't know, like the class photo, basically. And yeah, like you're saying, they zoom in, and then you barely notice the transition to suddenly it's live. It's like a live action image that we're being presented with. That's a really cool little bit of like all that is that you just match the frames from like whatever photo you've taken. Like the technique there would be like you film the scene and then you take that first frame and you make that first frame the image in the paper and then you just match them up in the editing bay. It's really simple, but it's such an effective transition between the scenes. And those little transitions between the scenes are kind of the coolest little bits of trickery here because we get that kind of use of almost montage. There are so many scenes where a conversation starts in one time period, like we see with Kane and his first wife, and it ends in a different time period. And the conversation is consistent across the years, but it takes on a very different meaning by the time we get to a later point in time. So I think that first starts with a younger Kane and Thatcher, and then it's suddenly Kane is selling his newspaper business to Thatcher because of the stock market crash. He needs cash for his other ventures. So things like that are really cool. We also see it in Leland and Kane are in the car outside the newspaper, and but the camera starts at like looking, I don't know, X number of floors up. And it's just this kind of like exterior shot through the windows of people working at the newspaper. And the camera, it doesn't really pan down so much as it just like moves down gradually. It is not staying stationary. It's not like the camera is turning on an axis. It's just moving downwards. There's a little
like an elevator.
Yeah, kind of like it's doing that elevator action, and there's a bit of a little cross dissolve to kind of mask. We were on this set, now we're on this set. It's not, seamless, but then suddenly we're at Kane and Leland in the car having a conversation about the newspaper business. I love that little bit. There's also the one where you've got the incredible, the iconic reaction gif of Kane clapping as enthusiastically as possible with the most stone-faced expression on his face.
Mm-hmm.
And we see the tiniest Susan Alexander down on the stage, flowers being launched at her to the point where she's overwhelmed with the flowers. It is clear that this is like that Kane is paying to have a ton of flowers thrown at her. This is not a good performance. She is out of her element as an opera singer. Anyways, the camera does that elevator move upwards this time through the kind of rafters of the theater into the rigging, and then it lands on two rigging operators who are looking down, and one of them looks at the other and just shakes his head. So
the other pinches his nose. It was a good moment.
So it's just these little moments. So little tricks like that are such cool little transition elements that they keep us moving through the story without it being, the use of an establishing shot exists to signify we're in a new location, to introduce us to a new location. Oftentimes in this movie, we're kind of just thrust into the new location and the new scene without that kind of like downtime, without any rest between action and events. And it really propels the story forward. Because otherwise, this is admittedly I don't know that it would necessarily be the most exciting and dynamic subject matter. Like, it's interesting stuff.
Yeah.
But there is a world in which this is a much drier movie with great performances, but a bit more of a boring watch.
There is a scene where Susan is gone, and then suddenly there's a loud cockatiel or some kind of bird, like tropical bird, that screams. I jumped. Yeah. I fully jumped. And then we go from like the dark interior after he's tossed her room to outside where she has left, looking at the beautiful view that he's got at his house.
Yeah.
What was that? Why?
Why the bird?
Why the bird? We haven't seen animals this entire movie, and then we have a bird screaming at us.
So the bird screaming is like that. It's just there. There's just a bird there. That's it. Like I don't know why there's a bird there. I couldn't tell you why there's a bird there. I think a ton of critics have actually a ton of critics and viewers have commented on like, what the hell is this bird doing in this movie? Why is that scene there? Why is that shot there?
Yeah.
Maybe they're trying to like break things up, or like maybe it is just an attempt to troll the audience, a bit of a jump scare. I couldn't tell you. I have no idea what that bird's doing in there.
I mean, I could probably make an argument for it's a representation of how much she, as this bird that he has kept in a cage for so long, has disrupted his life. But like, I don't know.
It's just out of the blue.
Again,
yeah.
I don't trust this movie. Even that moment with the two guys in the rafters, I'm like, is that because the reporter interviewed a bunch of people that worked at the theater and they remember that moment? Like every single little piece of this film, I'm just like, what?
But that's kind of the point, though. Like, you're meant to think, like, how reliable are these narrators?
Yes.
The movie, like, the lens of the filmmaker is... How do I phrase this? Wells, or the camera, I should say, is as objective as it can be. But... again, we're seeing everything through, like, everything that we were treated to, you have to remember, is like a flashback or a secondhand telling of something. So, I think that's the point. The point is that how much do you trust what these people are saying? How, like, this Kane, is Kane a villain? Is Kane a hero? A fascist? A communist? Or does he just contain multitudes? And is that the point? Because... there's also significant chunks of the movie are about him, his manipulation of public opinion through his journalism, through his publishing business, to sway opinion on the Spanish-American War. He has that line. This line is an adaptation of something Hearst actually said, I think in a slightly different context, but Kane says, "You provide the prose poems, I'll provide the war." Because he sends a journalist out to Spain about like what's going on with the war, like what's going on with war sentiment out there, and the journalist is like, all I'm giving you are prose poems because there's no war here, and you get the line. So he manipulates public opinion, but simultaneously he also tries to manipulate public opinion for the greater good, maybe. The greater good also seems to coincide with what's good for Kane here and there. But, you know, we are presented to him. We get that scene of him confronting Thatcher about Thatcher's business interests. Turns out, and like I was saying, he's attacking his own business interests. So, I don't know. Like, I think a lot of the point is that the unreliable narrator, the subjectiveness of memory, the self-serving nature of memory. You know, I think all that is really incredible and really interesting in this movie.
So we're getting close to the end. I want to touch on the last scenes. First, when we're at Xanadu, his big palatial home that is always unfinished. It is huge, stately, unnecessarily grand.
Yeah.
And all we see are crates everywhere. And previously, we've seen the one very roomy space that Susan occupied, where she had bric-a-brac all over the place, and books and cozy bedding and a low ceiling. And we've seen the big halls that are massive and empty. And yet he had this, and had been known throughout the film, to have this massive collection of statuary, including, but not limited to, multiple Venus de Milos, for which he paid something to the effect of over $2,000 for a broad without a head. and talk to me about, as we watch all of these reporters from his own magazine and others descend upon his house, and they are making their way through all of this bric-a-brac that is, supposedly what meant anything to him, all crated up.
Mm-hmm.
Which then leads us into the final moments of the film, which we'll get to that, spoiler, in just a moment. These wide shots. What does this tell us? Or how would you interpret these wide shots now as we are getting close to the end, and these reporters are looking at all of this stuff and just kind of commenting on all of the stuff that he's collected over the years?
Yeah, I think it's meant to be like the idea that he, early on in his life, he's just collecting art for the sake of collecting art. He's collecting wealth. He's collecting status. And we are shown in a very physical sense the scope of his wealth, the extent of his wealth. But it didn't mean anything to him. It was a collection for the sake of a collection to show that he could do it, that he had that power, that he had that control, that authority. And they're wandering through this palatial estate. Like, to call it a house, to call it home, is not really accurate. It is huge. The newsreel even calls out that Xanadu, which is the name of this estate, is it was always under construction, and towards the end of his life, parts of it were like in disrepair. Just like it was falling apart towards the end. Not through necessarily, certainly through lack of care, but not because he couldn't afford to keep doing it. Like, the interest wasn't there. Something went out of his life. But I think it's just, to me, I interpret all this stuff like he gathered stuff. He collected things for the sake of it, because it was the act of collecting and gathering and controlling that was what meant something to him. And I think also, like, as I'm thinking about it, the fact that his estate is called Xanadu, they call out that is a reference to the supposed pleasure dome of Kublai Khan. It is explicitly a literary reference to the poem Kublai Khan, or A Vision in a Dream by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which in Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome command. And the poem is literally about the creation of this immense symbol of wealth and power, and then how it is functionally all for naught. Beautiful poem. As I think about it, though, I may be thinking of the sick prog rock song by Rush that is about, it's this incredible pleasure dome, and I am trapped by it. Which is, of course, inspired by the poem as well. But I might be leaning more on the sick guitar riffs than I think.
Well, it's funny too, because the collecting part specifically, because earlier on in the film, when he is wooing his first wife, the president's niece, he declares via telegram while he's in Europe that he's going to buy the biggest diamond in existence. Mm-hmm. And they're like, I didn't know he cared about collecting diamonds, because they're standing in a room full of statuary, still in boxes. And one of the men is like, he's not collecting diamonds. He's collecting a woman who likes diamonds. Yeah. And then later on, when we see Susan, his second wife, she is decked out in jewelry, because that's how he learned to love, ? That's how he defines love or affection or whatever. Who can say? Yeah. But we just get this, like, as she's doing jigsaw puzzles, jewelry, gems, emeralds, sapphires, blah, 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 blah. Just her arms covered. Yeah. And to her, they are meaningless. And she said as much later on. The thing that is meaningful, though, and here's your 83-year-old spoiler, Rosebud is the name of a sled.
Yeah.
that he thwacked Mr. Thatcher with way back at the beginning of the movie that we never saw the top of because it was covered in snow.
Yeah.
And it gets tossed into an incinerator.
Yeah. Because no one knows the significance of it. Like the fact that like the dramatic irony of it is that you see the sled being thrown on the fire, we see the name of it, and it's like, oh, that's what it was. Because Thompson concludes, like, I guess we'll never know what the significance of his final words were. The significance of his final words, he was truly happy as a kid. He was happy playing in the snow, and he lost that somewhere along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Tragic.
Yep. So tragic. And it's even funny because the reporters are all in his house.
Mm-hmm.
In the house where they're burning all of the things. And nobody thought to tell the laborers, hey, keep an eye out for something with this word on it, just in case.
Yeah. Yeah. They just can't. Yep. Yeah. It's a mystery. It becomes a mystery for the ages. It's a wonderful.
Yes.
Not really a twist ending, but a last second reveal.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think the first time I watched it, I messaged you, the sled?
Yeah.
Question mark, exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point. And I stand by that reaction.
Yeah.
Because it is both meaningless and very meaningful, and God, this movie. So, Ben, we've talked a lot about all of the different cinematography coolness that was created in this film, basically. So, as your summary, if you want to learn about film, why do you watch this film?
If you want to learn about film, you watch this film because it is, if you think of the concept of the canon of film, of important films, you cannot discount Citizen Kane from that list. It has to be in there. The cinematographer Greg Toland did such an incredible job working with Wells as the director to put together a visually rich movie that in many ways feels like a stage play, but looks just so... There's a real look to a lot of it. And compared to a lot of other movies that might be coming out in the 40s, at least to my eyes, this movie seems a lot more modern. The kind of common language between modern film and Citizen Kane, there's a lot of stuff there. It is worth watching if you want to learn more about the history of filmmaking. It is worth watching if you want to learn more about, just common visual techniques and cinematic techniques that are nonetheless effective. It's also just a really, really enjoyable, interesting movie, and an engaging movie that has a lot of kind of thematic resonance about wealth and power to this day, and some great performances throughout. But Farrah, if you're just looking to watch something on a Friday night, why this one?
This is not a movie to watch on a Friday night when you're tired and you want to grab your favorite movie snacks and just hang out. This is not something you put on in the background if you want to pick up your Switch or your Steam Deck or whatever and just chill. Don't do it, because you're going to miss so much. That said, this is a movie to watch if you want to get all those rosebud jokes in The Simpsons and every other possible movie reference in Western movie cinema culture. Grab yourself some coffee, some tea, some popcorn, some Twizzler Buds, and put down your phone, because you're going to need to keep your eye on this movie as you go through it. Like I said, I enjoy it the way I enjoy House of Leaves. It is fascinating. It is beautiful. It does so many cool tricks, but sometimes you just want to watch a movie and be entertained, and this is, I don't think, the movie to do that with, and that's okay.
Yeah. There's a lot. It's not like a particularly long runtime, but it's not like there's not an action movie in here. There's not a ton of thrills. It is interesting. I mean, we've talked so much about like character and theme. We haven't even touched on really the legacy of this thing. That could be a whole episode in and of itself. We haven't even touched on the entire the quote unquote controversy around screenwriting this movie. That's a whole episode in and of itself. Long and short of it is, this is an important movie because of how it sits in film history.
Maybe one day we'll build a Patreon, and listener, you can hear Ben talk about this for hours on end. But for now, Ben, I would like you to talk about where the people can find you on the socials.
The people can find me on the socials on Letterboxd as Benjimon. I also have an Instagram account where I like to post nerdy stuff. It is at Cafe Cartography. Farrah, where can people find you? And where can people find more about this podcast?
Yeah, so the people can find this podcast at Coffee Kurosawa Pod on Instagram and as Coffee and Kurosawa on Facebook. You can find me at Farrah Sarpkaya on Instagram and Threads if you like artwork. I also do some of that. And you can find me at sarpkaya.ca if you like the sound of my voice, because I'm also a voice actor. What's next for us, Ben, as we round into almost the double digits of episodes?
Wild to think. What's next for us is the film Persepolis.
It is a beautiful graphic novel. If you have not read it, it is a beautiful film. I discovered it in college, and it is one of the ones that I recommended. So I'm very excited to nerd out about it a little bit. And I do believe that is it. Thank you all for listening. We look forward to seeing all your comments. Get like and subscribe, all of that fun stuff. I gotta. And we'll see you next time on Coffee and Kurosawa.